The second common use of the apostrophe is to indicate possession. A possessive is something that indicates who owns something. For example, my brother's book is the same thing as the book that my brother owns. The book that my brother owns is wordy, so we can substitute a possessive brothers for that, my brother's book. Or the paper of the student. We can make that possessive by saying the student's paper. Or the teacher's pen. It's the same thing as the pen that belongs to the teacher. So to avoid wordiness, we often use possessives. The teacher's pen, the student's paper, my brother's book. So when thinking about possessives, ask yourself the question, to whom does the object belong? The answer to that question is the possessive. So let's look at a couple of rules and try to understand why the apostrophe is so misused in writing in English language when it seems like it's a very simple thing. So rule number one is simple. When a noun is singular and does not end in S, we form the possessive by adding apostrophe S. Brothers, students, teachers, as we had in our previous examples. So rule number one seems so simple that we wonder why we have so many problems with the apostrophe in writing English. Well, one of the problem areas comes when the word that we want to make possessive already ends in an S. So there are a few rules we have to learn. When a noun is singular, one syllable, and ends in S, we form the possessive by adding apostrophe S. So for example, the boss's temper or James's promotion. Note that some style guides will recommend adding the apostrophe without the S, especially for proper nouns and names. Notice how I did not have any problem with saying the boss's temper, but I stumbled over saying James's promotion because I would have a natural tendency of just saying James' promotion, and therefore, since that's a proper noun, it's a name of a person, I would just put apostrophe after the S and drop off the final S. But the rule that's given here in your textbook is that when a noun is singular and one syllable, we add an apostrophe S to form the possessive. Rule number 3 tells us that when a noun is singular, more than one syllable, and ends in S, we form the possessive by adding only the apostrophe. A couple of examples, Mr. Smithers' estate or Illinois' Constitution. Note that once again, some style guides will recommend that even in these cases of nouns that end in S that are more than one syllable, we should still add an apostrophe S. But if you look at the examples I've chosen here, the extra S would include or introduce problems with pronunciation. For example, Mr. Smithers' estate, Illinois' Constitution. So generally, I agree with the rule that says we should only use an apostrophe in multisyllable words that end in S. The next rule for when a noun ends in S, when a noun is plural and ends in S, we form the possessive by adding only an apostrophe. So, for example, the student's graduation, the worker's grievances. So this is probably the area that gets the most confusing. When do we add an apostrophe S and when do we just add an apostrophe? So let me summarize the rules. If the noun is singular, you add an apostrophe S. If the noun is singular and ends in S, if it's one syllable, you add an apostrophe S. If it's more than one syllable, you add just an apostrophe. And if it's a plural ending in S, you add just an apostrophe. Those are the rules that you have to learn. Rule number 5. When a noun is plural and does not end in S, we form the possessive by adding an apostrophe S. A couple of examples: the men's softball team, the children's word. Rule number 5 can really be lumped together with rule number 1, in that what we're basically saying is any word that doesn't end in S forms its possessive by adding apostrophe S. So it doesn't really matter if the word is singular or plural. What matters is that it doesn't end in S. When we're creating the possessive of an indefinite pronoun, we add an apostrophe S. Anybody's guess, one's suspicion. So again, rather than calling this out as a separate rule, we can just lump it together with rule number 1, which is that if a word does not end in an S, and we want to make it possessive, it doesn't matter whether it's a noun or a pronoun, we can just add apostrophe S. Anyone's guess? One thing that does get complicated is when we have a possessive of a compound word. Normally, we would add the apostrophe S to the last word. So, the groom-to-be's suit, the maid of honor's dress. Another problem area with apostrophes is when we have joint versus individual ownership. If 2 or more people jointly possess an object, then only use one apostrophe with the last person in the list. So, for example, Lola and Tony's wedding was a day to remember. Lola and Tony got married. They jointly possess the word wedding, so we don't repeat the possessive on every object. We just include it on the one closest to the noun that is indicated being possessed by. If we refer to individual objects, however, then each gets its own possessive. Lola's and Tony's weddings were on the same day. And what this means is that they both got married on the same day, but not to each other. Notice the changes, too, in the sentence. In the first sentence, Lola and Tony's wedding was. One wedding and a singular verb, wedding was. In the second sentence, Lola's and Tony's weddings, plural, were. So we know that more than one wedding occurred. One wedding was Lola's and one wedding was Tony's. One other problem area that needs to be pointed out is where people put apostrophes where they're not needed. One of the common places that people put apostrophes where they're not needed is with the possessive pronouns. My, your, his, her, its, our, their, and then their possessive pronoun forms: mine, yours, his, hers, its, ours, theirs. The word's already possessive and it doesn't need an apostrophe. I think the confusion comes with the words that end in S. Then it's common for people to want to put an apostrophe there. But remember, pronouns, not the indefinite pronouns, but the possessive pronouns, already have the possession built into them. Therefore, you do not need to also include an apostrophe. And then the other common area of confusion is sometimes people will use an apostrophe to form the plural of regular words whose plural is formed by adding an S. A plural of a word that is formed by adding s does not need an apostrophe. And I think that confusion comes in the area that we're going to look at in the next lecture, which is when do we use an apostrophe s to form a plural? It's very rare, but it does happen. So don't confuse that with a regular plural that we just add an s. You do not need an apostrophe in those cases.